From Brazil to Japan, throughout much of Africa, across the European continent, and in every region of the United States. The reality is that poverty exists everywhere in every society and in every city and town and village. Poverty is the one common denominator shared by all societies. The differences are differences of degree only. In too many parts of the world, a large number of people die each day of starvation. Our world has become a relatively small place as our population has grown from 1 to 6 billion over just the last 2 centuries. Our footprint on the earth is heavy, and the growth in our numbers adds to the stress we place on our planet's capacity to sustain life. Clearly, we must change the way we interact with our environment if we are to avoid catastrophic disasters. Despite our advances in social organization and our scientific discoveries, we have not come close to solving the plague of poverty that grips the lives of at least 2 billion people every day. This is what might be best called the poverty paradox. We are about to examine the basis for this paradox in an attempt to answer the question of why, in a world of great prosperity, are so many others still denied the opportunity for a decent human existence. There was a time before poverty when ancient peoples lived off what the earth freely provided. Survival was always tenuous, and the world in which they lived seemed both bountiful and mysterious. The necessity of migration limited the accumulation of material goods. Survival depended upon cooperation, and the ancients learned to care for members who became ill or injured. What they possessed was an enduring sense of community. Theirs was a meager living, but a living for all. Elders were respected for their acquired wisdom, their oral record of the group's past glories in history, and the frequency of events such as floods or droughts. Every society honored and elevated its knowledge bearers. And then groups began to settle in one place. Permanent structures arose, and the internal structure of these tribal societies began to evolve. Hunter-protector subgroups evolved into warrior oppressors who came to rule over the others. Knowledge bearers converted their understanding of the natural world into a priestcraft. Conflict became inevitable as migrating groups encountered others and competed over territory and access to necessary resources. The communitarian social structure broke down, and hierarchy became the new societal norm. Warrior chiefs became kings, and with them the priests shared a growing power to extort wealth from producers. Settlement brought on other structural changes to societies. Where once nature had seemed a limitless bounty provided by the gods, settled groups looked upon outsiders as threats to their security and their control over land and natural resources. Internally, rules allocating and protecting access to land, to water, to surrounding forests and other natural resources were required. Settlement also stimulated the development of writing and the formalizing of norms into codes of law. The role of the scribe, entrusted to keep a record of exchanges and claims to property, emerged as commercial activities expanded. Greater authority also came to the priests, whose members separated themselves from the group by claiming an exclusive ability to communicate with the gods. Although the role of spiritual leader could be symbiotic and harmonious, a persistent pattern emerged where the priests came to use their knowledge for self-enrichment. In this new world, for the first time, poverty appeared as a permanent condition. And slavery provided the labor to build our earliest cities and monuments. Rigid class systems arose to dominate how ancient empires were ruled. Great landed estates, called latifundia, characterized the Roman and other empires. These landed estates were worked by armies of slaves who could be purchased at much less cost than that required to employ a landless peasant. By the 1st century BC, the Roman Empire included some 2 million slaves out of a total of just 5 million people. Slavery and the constant threat of slave uprisings turned Rome into a brutal police state. However, history reveals that the Roman experience was not unique. Peasant and slave uprisings continuously challenged the ruling elites of ancient India and China as well. Japan experienced over 1,100 peasant revolts during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, as did Tsarist Russia and much of Europe. A power vacuum arose in the Old World after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. Muslim armies spread across northern Africa and eventually seized Jerusalem. At the end of the 11th century, Pope Urban II responded by calling for a holy war to liberate Jerusalem, and in 1097, nearly 10,000 soldiers journeyed eastward. Historians estimate that Crusaders killed nearly 70,000 Muslims fighting their way to take the holy city. Muslims were also driven from the northern Iberian Peninsula. Violence by Christians against Jews also occurred as an integral part of this period of nation-state building, accompanied as it was by religious and ethnic cleansing. When Muslim forces retook Jerusalem, the Crusaders went on to sack the Christian city of Constantinople. Returning princes brought with them the plundered riches of Constantinople and the eastern peoples. This acquired wealth funded a new era of city building and commerce, but also brought on the intensified exploitation of those who worked the land. As long-standing feudal relations began to disintegrate, the lords of the land began demanding cash money as rents instead of a portion of the crops harvested. Peasants had to bring their crops to new town markets, taking on the risks of bad weather and crop failure, infestation, and other attacks on their harvest. Failure to pay rents and taxes meant eviction from the land or debt slavery. Although an integrated cash economy was evolving, societal norms disintegrated as land became a commodity to be bought, sold, and mortgaged. Predictably, as markets expanded throughout the Old World and some benefited, life for most peasants hardened. Moreover, a complete renaissance throughout the European continent was impeded by entrenched privilege, by continuous civil and territorial warfare, by plague, and by religious convulsions. All combined to foster a centuries-long era of escalating ethnic and religious cleansings that set the stage for consolidation of feudal principalities into the European system of nation-states. Then began the voyages of exploration and Old World claims to territory everywhere else around the globe. Christian rulers committed to removal of all non-Christians from Europe pushed the Moors from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492. Spaniards then turned their attention to all Jewish and mixed-blood inhabitants. Tensions between religious and ethnic factions climaxed early in the 17th century, resulting in the 30 Years' War. Calvinism, Lutheranism, and other Protestant sects expanded at the expense of Catholicism. At the same time, Europeans were opening the new era of exploration and discovery. Henry the Navigator led the way when he ventured from Portugal into the Atlantic, discovering the Madeira Islands in 1419, then the Azores in 1427. Exploration was followed by exploitation as a vanguard of Spanish conquistadors, spreading smallpox and other diseases as they went, conquered the Aztec and Incas of Central America. From this point on, the European nation-states competed for control over territories and the riches they found. The people who inhabited these lands were run off, enslaved, or annihilated. Back in their homelands, aristocratic nobles privatized the land and gradually added the commons to their private domains. Landed aristocracies competed with yeoman farmers as well as a new breed of commercial farm owners raising cattle or sheep for an expanding global market. For landlords, rents soared. The dispossessed migrated to the towns and cities or to the colonies established by exploration and conquest. Evictions accelerated as landlords pursued higher profits than could be extracted as rents taken from peasant farmers. Colonies provided privileged elites with a safety valve against uprisings of the dispossessed. Absentee landlordism and land monopoly sent nearly 500,000 Irish peasants fleeing for their very lives after the mid-19th century. And the Irish experience was repeated throughout the Old World. On the island continent of Australia, desperate migrants found a sparsely populated continent at the far edge of the known world, where their numbers slowly increased until 1851, when gold was discovered. Not only did immigration from Britain explode, others arrived from the European continent, from North America, and from China. Over the decade of the 1850s, the population of Australia doubled to over 1 million. Beginning in the 16th century, European colonists were starting over in the Americas and elsewhere, but burdened by Old World norms and greed. Unchallenged for more than a century, Spain's empire continued to expand early into the 17th century. During that time, some 200,000 Spaniards arrived in the Western Hemisphere to establish settlements throughout the territory they controlled. After disease, war, and forced labor in the silver and gold mines decimated the native populations, the Spaniards were forced to import slaves captured in Africa. The Spanish were followed by Portuguese, Dutch, French, and English adventurers, dissenters, and tens of thousands of farming families. Then, as the fortunes of Spain and Portugal declined later in the 17th century, Britain and France emerged as the most powerful nation-states. Europeans, including their colonial subjects, lived in an almost constant state of warfare. In time, Descendants of those Europeans, accustomed for over a century to self-sufficiency, declared their sovereignty and independence from Old World monarchy and aristocracy. And yet, they not only failed to purge their new society of the evil of slavery, they institutionalized a land tenure system that turned land speculation into a national creed. The seeds of future calamities were firmly planted. Everywhere around the world, borders changed frequently and populations were dispossessed again and again. Throughout the 19th century, more and more of the dispossessed came to North America. European farmers, with some financial assets but not enough land to pass to their children, were able to sell their property in Europe and purchase hundreds or thousands of acres of land in North America. Others squatted on public land, hoping to one day secure ownership. Yet roughly half of those who arrived did so as indentured servants, their labor owned for some specified period of years. As the 19th century came to a close, Europe, including Russia, lost more than 1/3 of its Jewish population, 90% of whom came to the United States. Early on, immigrants chased the promise of free or cheap land. However, many others, without financial resources, were forced into crowded urban slums. In the cities and the countryside, immigrants were systematically exploited. As they could, the new arrivals moved from the crowded Atlantic coastal regions into the interior, driven by the hunger for a better life. Always, land speculators arrived first to claim the best and most fertile land. Corporations were awarded huge grants of public land in return for vague commitments to construct rail lines, canals, and other so-called internal improvements. By 1900, the North American frontier safety valve, ever moving, had closed. Analyzing the role of the frontier in creating American social and cultural norms, as well as its political institutions and system of law, became the passion of a young historian, Frederick Jackson Turner. Turner's frontier thesis stirred a century-long debate among historians. He concluded that the frontier served to push back the onslaught of privilege and old world poverty, at least for a time, writing, "The most important effect of the frontier has been in the promotion of democracy here and in Europe." Yet what Turner had to acknowledge was that after a mere century, the United States already lost its unique status as a nation of self-reliant freeholders. Land ownership was already concentrated in the hands of a wealthy and politically powerful minority. Events proved the American experience differed, if at all, by degree only from the rest of the world's societies. Today, ownership of wealth in the United States is more highly concentrated than in many parts of the Old World. And despite the enormous productive capability of its population, the gap between the haves and the have-nots is widening daily. The extent to which land and nature generally has come under the control of a small minority is revealed by the fact that just 1% of all U.S. households control 60% of the value of all shares of stock in companies that are major owners of locations in cities and in natural resource-laden lands. Few households own more than the small parcel of land on which their home is constructed, and roughly 1/3 of all households do not even own a home. Social commentators have provided a legacy of confused analysis, ineffective or counterproductive solutions, often because they were prevented from being completely objective by an adherence to traditional values or revolutionary zeal. Four of the major voices of their time were Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and Karl Marx. And then, late in the 19th century, there came Henry George. Jeremy Bentham, architect of the utilitarian perspective, argued that all laws must meet the single ethical test of utility. John Stuart Mill, Bentham's student, championed the creation of worker-owned cooperatives and the limiting of population as keys to poverty reduction. Coming closer to identifying the cause of poverty, Proudhon, the proponent of mutualist cooperatives, declared, "God gave the earth to the human race. Why then have I received none? He has put all things under my feet, and I have nowhere to lay my head." And Karl Marx, in the Communist Manifesto, called for the abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. However, none gave the right emphasis to the injustice of privatizing the ownership of land, its rent, and its value until Henry George did so in the late 19th century. Henry George's solution to the persistence of poverty required a direct attack on entrenched privilege. In his great work, Progress and Poverty, he declared, "To relieve labor and capital from all taxation and to throw the burden upon rent would be to counteract this tendency to inequality, and if it went so far as to take in taxation the whole of rent, the cause of inequality would be totally destroyed. Rent, instead of causing inequality as now, would then promote equality." Unfortunately, George's campaign to bring an end to poverty was overwhelmed by powerful opposing forces. Men such as John D. Rockefeller and Leland Stanford represented powerful landed as well as financial interests. There were many others as well. George's reform program, which came to be referred to as the single tax, found only short-lived widespread support, sounding like a utopian dream to many. Those who had made their fortunes from legal privilege, from land speculation and exploiting the poor, made a determined effort to discredit his analysis. As the 20th century advanced, the world stage became an ideological battleground. To the progressive Theodore Roosevelt, poverty might be softened but never eliminated. He acknowledged that there are districts populated to the point of congestion, where hardly anyone is above the level of poverty, though this poverty does not by any means always imply misery. Where it does mean misery, it must be met by organization, and above all, by the disinterested, endless labor of those who, by choice and to do good, live in the midst of it, temporarily or permanently. Roosevelt and Henry George had campaigned against one another for the office of mayor of New York City in 1886. During the campaign, Roosevelt indignantly responded to attacks by George's supporters, writing, "If you had any conception of the true American spirit, you would know we do not have classes at all on this side of the world. Some of the evils of which you complain are real and can be to a certain degree remedied, but not by the remedies you propose." To a young and politically ambitious Winston Churchill, the struggle was between liberalism and socialism. "Socialism," he wrote, "seeks to pull down wealth. Liberalism seeks to raise up poverty. Socialism would destroy private interests. Liberalism would preserve private interests by reconciling them with public right. Socialism would kill enterprise. Liberalism would rescue enterprise from the trammels of privilege and preference. Socialism attacks capital. Liberalism attacks monopoly. And for a brief period, Churchill sounded very much like Henry George on the question of what to do about the land. Campaigning in 1909, Churchill declared, "Land, which is a necessity of human existence, which is the original source of all wealth, which is strictly limited in extent, which is fixed in geographical position. Land, I say, differs from all other forms of property in these primary and fundamental conditions." George's perspectives also found support in Russia from Leo Tolstoy, who some years later penned the novel Resurrection around the theme of Henry George's land reform. After reading Henry George's book Social Problems, Tolstoy became convinced that George's program would save Russia from chaos and revolution. Tolstoy wrote to a German correspondent, "An enlightenment of men's consciences is going on in relation to the way land is used, and soon, it seems to me, a practical application of this new consciousness must follow. And in this process, the leader and organizer of the movement was and is Henry George. In this lies his preeminent importance." And even the Chinese nationalist Sun Yat-sen was deeply influenced by Henry George's ideals. In 1921, Sun wrote, "The Industrial Revolution in the European and American countries produced a sudden change in people's living conditions. Its effect on society is exactly similar to that which Henry George described in his book, Progress and Poverty." He said that the progress of modern civilization is like a sharp wedge suddenly driven in between the upper and lower classes. The rich become richer, while the poor become ever poorer. The results of the Industrial Revolution bring happiness only to a few members of society, but inflict pain and suffering on the great part of the people. This ideological ferment accelerated during history's bloodiest century. 2 world wars caused the death of nearly 100 million people. Civil wars in Russia and China killed another 80 million. And the list of deadly wars has continued all around the globe. Predictably, the world's leaders learned nothing from the massive killing power demonstrated during the First World War. And a global depression ignited fires of imperial ambition, renewed ethnic nationalism, and racial cleansing. In the United States, a new president embraced a pragmatic mandate that would later be known as liberalism or social democracy. His New Deal softened the worst effects of widespread poverty, but left landed privilege unchallenged. At the same time in Britain, a Labour government responded to economic collapse with orthodox economic strategies and commitment to a balanced budget. Retaliatory tariffs had drastically reduced trade, and by the end of 1930, 2.5 million British workers were unemployed. Britain's celebrated economist, John Maynard Keynes, had little good to say about the steps taken at that point by Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Snowden. Practically all the remedies popularly advocated today are of this internecine character: competitive wage reductions, competitive tariffs, competitive liquidation of foreign assets, competitive currency deflations, competitive economy campaigns, all are of this beggar my neighbor description. And yet, Keynes was unprepared for what was yet to come. The financial crisis might wear itself out before a point of catastrophe and general default had been reached. This is perhaps happening. The greatest dangers may have been surmounted during the past few months. Philip Snowden's answer was to call for dramatic cuts in government spending and wage reductions for government employees. Speaking before members of the House of Commons in mid-1932, Snowden described what had been done. This government have effected greater economies in national expenditure during their short length of office than any other government of the past. He also commented on the government's decision to allow the nation's currency to find its own exchange value against other currencies. There may be advantages in a low exchange value of sterling, but there are undoubtedly great disadvantages too, and the less we deliberately try to regulate the rate of exchange, the better it will be for the trade and industry of the country. Yet a year later, unemployment had climbed to 3 million. Britain took the drastic steps of abandoning the gold standard, cutting interest rates, and devaluing its currency. Exports slowly increased and employment began to recover, but poverty remained a serious problem and the political situation became even more volatile. Then, with the end of the 1930s, the world leaders took their nations into yet another global war. With the escalating production of weapons and armaments, the Great Depression was brought to an end. The eventual cost was over 70 million dead, countless population centers utterly destroyed, and widespread devastation. Around the globe, the expectations of oppressed peoples heightened as the victorious nations met to plan the post-war world system. Many were given hope by the words of Franklin Roosevelt, who had condemned colonialism as a great evil and committed the United States to bring about its demise. As he put it, exploit the resources of an India, a Burma, a Java. Take all the wealth out of these countries but never put anything back into them. Things like education, decent standards of living, minimum health requirements. All you're doing is storing up the kind of trouble that leads to war. However, when colonial rulers refused to withdraw, the stage was set for prolonged bloody struggles. Eventual independence was gained, but entrenched poverty and too often despotic domestic regimes continued to oppress their people. And many decades later, poverty remains the world's common denominator. An estimated 800 million people experience chronic hunger, despite the fact that enough food is produced around the world to provide every person with adequate nourishment. The principal problem is that many people in the world do not have sufficient land to grow or income to purchase enough food. Thus, if poverty is the common denominator of all societies, landlessness is the common denominator of those who suffer from intense poverty. With each day, the control over land and nature generally is becoming ever more concentrated. An estimated 95% of all privately held land around the globe is controlled by no more than 2 or 3% of the world's population. And in the cities, where land values are measured by the square foot rather than by the acre, ownership is most highly concentrated. In New York City, for example, only 1/3 of all households are homeowners, and the majority live in high-rise cooperatives or condominium housing units in buildings that occupy small but very valuable parcels of land. Yet it is in the cities where community investment in public goods and services gives enormous financial value to locations. Consistently, these values that are directly created by the community as a whole and not by what any individual does or does not do with land held, are only minimally captured as public revenue, allowing owners to hold land out of use with very little financial penalty. Almost everywhere in the United States and around the globe, land speculation is encouraged by low effective annual taxes on land values. In all but a few dozen communities in the United States, specifically in Pennsylvania, most of the revenue generated by the taxation of real estate comes from heavy taxes on homes and other buildings. Other revenue is derived by taxing earned income from wages, business profits, and commerce. The net result is that the cost of living climbs and climbs until the stress brings on economic collapse. Minority groups generally feel the effects first and most seriously. Rather than capture societally created land values or require polluters to pay for the harm they do to the environment, governments continue to raise most revenue by penalizing activities that are desirable and add to the well-being of the members of the community. Lingering and worsening poverty is a consequence. We should not need to be reminded of the faces of poverty. They are everywhere. Remarkably, our global institutions publish statistics telling us that absolute poverty is on the decline. However, back in 2002, a report issued by the United Nations Economic and Social Council acknowledged the problem of acquiring accurate data from governments reluctant to channel resources to the poorest of their citizens. We know that a growing number of people around the world do not have anywhere near the income required to live decently. Government policies in some countries subsidize the export of agricultural commodities in the face of rising food prices and even domestic food shortages. Something is terribly wrong when people are starving while food is grown for export. Globally, some 36 million people are dying annually of hunger. Over 700 million people do not have access to a minimally adequate supply of food. 9 of every 10 hungry person lives in a developing nation. A solution is readily available to us. As we learned from Henry George over a century ago, poverty will be eliminated when the exchange value of nature, that is, the societally created rent fund, is fully collected as the primary source of revenue for public goods and services. In George's own words, "In our time, as in times before, creep on the insidious forces that, producing inequality, destroy liberty. It is not enough that men should vote. It is not enough that they should be theoretically equal before the law. They must have liberty to avail themselves of the opportunities and means of life. They must stand on equal terms with reference to the bounty of nature. Either this or darkness comes on, and the very forces that progress has evolved turn to powers that work destruction." Yes, poverty is everywhere. Something must be done, and done soon. Thank you.